The other big international relations news this week has been Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And I want to go into the significance of this visit. I think there is some relationship here to Ukraine and Russia, how Russia's relationship with Ukraine has been. I want you to give us some background on the Chinese relationship with Taiwan and why this is so significant for Nancy Pelosi to visit Taiwan and what China intends or what China wants to do with Taiwan.
All right. So go back to the Chinese Revolution in 1949. At that time, the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong defeated their opponents, who were known as the nationalists, under a guy called Chiang Kai-shek. That was 1949. Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists, basically losing the war in China, decamped to this island off sea called Formosa or Taiwan. And said, we're the real government of China, but for the time being, we're in Taiwan because we lost this war. So there were these two governments claiming to be the government of China. And I should say that from 1949 until sometime in the 1970s, I don't quite have the year in my head, the United States recognized the government of Taiwan as the government of China. And to the extent that our allies around the world supported us, the Chinese seat at the UN, and including the Security Council and the veto, until sometime in the 1970s, and I want to say 1978, but that might not be right, was actually held by the government of Taiwan, not the government of China. For reasons that had to do with trying to jockey against the Soviet Union and trying to get the Vietnam War ended, the United States pivoted in the 1970s to say, no, we're going to recognize the communist government of China as the actual government of China because they're the government of China. This was the famous Nixon going to China, ping pong diplomacy, which, if you've ever seen one of the, I think, most agonizing movies ever made that everybody but me and my wife loves, which is called Forrest Gump. There's this whole thing where Forrest Gump.
How can you not like Forrest Gump?
Oh, my God.
We won't get into this, Paul. Okay, we're going to save this argument for another time. But this is
there's like this
from Alabama.
Ping pong episode in Forrest Gump, right? And the ping pong episode in Forrest Gump was this it was a big step at that time for a bunch of Americans and a bunch of Chinese to play. I should call it table tennis, its proper term. Because prior to that time, there was no contacts whatsoever between the U.S. and China. So that's the origin of sort of the China-Taiwan thing. Both China and Taiwan sort of in the abstract say there's only one China, and it includes both China and Taiwan. They've always disagreed, of course, on who should run it. Over time, the Taiwanese government has basically come to basically see itself as a separate sovereign state of Taiwan. China says, no dice, you belong to us. And so every country in the world has sort of been forced to not necessarily recognize one or the other. But if you recognize the government of Taiwan as a government of a state, the Chinese get very, very angry at you. The United States, going back to the 70s again, decided to withdraw its official recognition of Taiwan, but we supply them with lots of weapons, and we continue to say,
they don't recognize Taiwan right now
as
a sovereign state?
We have all kinds of relations with Taiwan, but we adhere to this notion that there's only one China because we want to have decent relations with China. And so the sort of status quo for really since the 70s has been, we won't recognize Taiwan and you won't attack it. China, not only being a very big, very powerful country, but also being good Marxists, sort of believe that inevitably in history, time is on their side. And so it's always been this idea that as long as the Chinese feel like time is on their side, there's no need to attack. I think, and I was in China a couple of years ago and talked to some people there, and sort of even people in China who are pretty pro-Western, when I asked them, if the United States were, or if Taiwan were to declare its independence and sovereignty, well, then would you want? And they all said, oh yeah, then I would support attacking. it's a big deal. It's a big sort of national thing for China, even for the ones who aren't nut jobs. More recently, Xi Jinping, I think the thing that I fear and that others have begun to fear is that Xi Jinping doesn't seem to want to wait forever. And he seems a little bit like Putin in this respect, in that he's got this idea that he's going to be a great man in history. And there's this idea that maybe he's going to try to push this. And if he wants to get it done sooner rather than later, it might require.
I mean, there's so many parallels here, right? Xi Jinping has essentially, he's president for life in China as well.
Well,
at this
that
point,
seems
right?
to be what he's declared. And of course,
limit.
The Chinese are going to have one of their big 5-year party conferences they don't announce it in advance, but probably October, November this year. And if he gets selected for a third term, which everybody expects, that will sort of break the 2-term rule in Chinese politics.
Very much what kind of Putin did. I mean, he did a kind of a roundabout way with Medvedev, and then doing that. And then I'm sure he was probably watching what was going on with Russia and Ukraine very, very closely. In fact, him and Putin were very much kind of buddying it up before the conflict as well, right? And if that had gone well, I assume it would have kind of given a more open invitation for Chinese aggression. Is that a correct analysis?
I think I would call it a good question, which is I've been one to say that, I don't think the Chinese are unsophisticated that they're going to, in a really kind of stupid way or just sort of automatically assume what applies to Ukraine applies to Taiwan. There's lots of differences. But in terms of seeing kind of how the world responds, absolutely. Absolutely. And seeing what the consequences have been, absolutely. And even, I think actually the most important thing is the reminder that sometimes very powerful states have a very rough time with countries that you think they can easily conquer. Hopefully has been sobering to Xi and his comrades.
Well, why is Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan at this point?
I don't know the exact origins of that visit. I will say members of the U.S. Congress have been traveling to Taiwan for decades. It generally makes the Chinese very cranky. Say, when I was in graduate school 30 years ago, the president of Taiwan came to visit Cornell, and I maybe gave some kind of commencement address or something. And the Chinese were very cranky about that he would even be sort of allowed into the United States. So there's always been this low-level disagreement about, do you have any interaction whatsoever? I think that Pelosi's status, she's not just a member of Congress, she's the Speaker of the House. And the fact that tensions have ratcheted up in recent years, the Chinese have kind of inflated their nationalist rhetoric and so on. I think this has all made it a little bit more serious.
So one of the things that happened is it was in the news yesterday or the day before. The Chinese shot a missile over Taiwan. And then also fallout continues. China announces canceling its dialogue with the United States on military talks and climate change. It'll no longer be cooperating with the U.S. on climate change talks, drug control, repatriation of illegal immigrants, criminal investigations, and combating transnational crimes. So what is this fallout? Is this just talk, or is there actual real-world consequences?
I think that there's substance in some of that stuff. I mean, all of those things you talked about matter. I suspect that after a reasonable period of time, most of those things you've talked about, those conversations will begin happening again, probably informally. It's a tricky thing. The United States and China have this massive, massive trade relationship. And in order to keep doing that, there has to be a certain amount of collaboration. And so I think the trick is to, on one level you are fighting each other, but on another level you want to get the business done. I got another package from Amazon yesterday. And that stuff, most of it comes straight from China. So we want our stuff. What I think is interesting is in terms of the parallel with Ukraine. What both China and the United States are doing is they're both trying in a way to send signals to get the other one to back down, right? Neither the U.S. or China, nor Taiwan for that matter, wants to go to war over Taiwan. We want the war to be avoided by China letting Taiwan stay as it is until such time in the future that Taiwan says, yeah, we want to join you. Right? Taiwan wants the United States to say Taiwan is part of China, and if push comes to shove, we'll stand aside. Right? So so we're trying to avoid conflict while at the same time trying to get the outcome we want, not the outcome the other side wants. So it's a very difficult game. But that's essentially the situation we were in with Russia, and in a way still are with Russia, right? We're both sides trying to get the outcome they want without provoking the other one too much. Trying to convince the other, you might as well give in because you're going to lose this battle anyhow. And you don't want to escalate. What's interesting, two things are interesting just militarily as we think about, and I'll try to keep this quick. When you look at Taiwan and China, on one hand, Taiwan is much better suited to defending itself than Ukraine ever was. Ukraine's been begging for the West to give it old Soviet era MiG aircraft. The Taiwanese Air Force has something like 150 F-16s supplied by the United States. They have Patriot missiles. They have Harpoon anti-ship missiles. The United States has been arming the Taiwanese for decades. This makes the Chinese very cranky. So the level of hardware that Taiwan already has, before anybody ever attacks it, is at a completely different level. That's one.
It's also an island nation, which I assume makes it.
It's an island, which means now you're talking about an amphibious assault. Not an easy thing to do, right? The other thing is, once you get on the beaches at Taiwan, it's a very mountainous country. It's not like the plains of eastern Ukraine, right? So there are those three things. What we see of these this is why I think these exercises in China, for me this week, have been really important, is because at least maybe China specialists have known this all along. But for me, the light bulb has gone off. The Chinese strategy is not just going to be to storm the beaches. Chinese strategy is going to be to surround Taiwan and blockade it. So the strategy has really basically been about closing the sea lanes of communication to Taiwan, and that helps explain why China keeps on building this bigger navy. Now, you stick a bunch of ships out there in the ocean, and nowadays most military experts consider big navy ships to be liabilities because they are very large targets, they're hard to hide. They don't go in, they don't move very fast, and so on. So that's the kind of the battle that we're fighting in the preparation for the battle. Can China surround and squeeze Taiwan? Can Taiwan start sinking big Chinese ships? Right.
What are we close to this type of scenario happening? Do you think? I mean, you don't think so? There's just too much going on. I imagine China would be ostracized from the world community, much like Russia was.
So you can never account for craziness, right? If Xi Jinping loses the plot, well, who knows? But in the long term, the correlation of forces, to use the Marxist term, the correlation of forces is going to continue to shift in China's favor. So why would you do this now when, even if you are going to do it, it would be easier to do 10 years from now or 20 years from now? Well, that might have to do with Xi Jinping's sense of his place in history. The other thing is that I think there are things that China could do short of a full-blown invasion of Taiwan that would be really dramatic. So this gets us back to the geography. There are a couple of islands that have been controlled by Taiwan since 1949 that are basically right up next to China, like 5 kilometers or maybe 5 miles. But either way, it's not very far from the southern Chinese city of Xiamen. Right, I was in Xiamen, and you can just look across the sea and see these islands. Those China, I'll just say in the 1950s, China started shelling those islands with artillery from the mainland, and the United States sailed a carrier task force into the Taiwan Straits, basically to say, if you keep doing this, we're going to bomb you. Now in 2022, I have to believe that if China were to seize those islands, Taiwan probably couldn't do too much about it, and the United States probably wouldn't. So if they want to get a big victory, that would be a huge victory that wouldn't start World War III.
Mm-hmm. Is there too much economic interdependence between the United States and China to really have that type of scenario, World War III type scenario?
I think if we've learned anything over the last 30 years, it's that trade does not make for happy friends. And that's true. I don't think it's a deterrent. So now we got to do some history of international relations. In 1908, Norman Angell, a British, I don't know what he was, a historian, publicist, he published a book that had a couple different titles. The American version of it was called The Grand Illusion. And basically what Angell argued was that the interdependence among the European states is so high that there really can't be war because it'd just be too expensive. And it was a very compelling book, right? He said the idea that accomplishing things with military force is still a viable option is the grand illusion because there was too much trade, right? European trade peaked in 1913, and we know what happened in 1914. And just to emphasize this, European trade did not return to its 1913 level until sometime in the late 1990s. I don't have the exact year. The point is, it was very interdependent. Wow. Germany and France, Germany and England in 1913-14, lots and lots and lots and lots of trade. Didn't stop them from slaughtering each other.
Okay. I mean, I guess it's just a matter of time. I mean, historically, China has been called, the sleeping giant. I don't think they could be quite referred to that anymore, but I'm just wondering, are we poking the sleeping giant a little bit here? And I'm not sure what the United States
so what does the United States get out of it? So this is a good question. Why not throw Taiwan under the bus? I think is the question. The way that the British threw Hong Kong under the bus. Right? The British back in the 1990s basically looked around and said, we can only hang on to Hong Kong so long. And rather than have the Chinese take it from us, we're going to negotiate this treaty by which we give it back to them. And of course now, and there were all these requirements for maintaining the liberties in Hong Kong. The Chinese have now violated all that stuff. And what's anybody going to do about it, right? So why not throw Taiwan under the bus? I'd like to think it's because we're Americans and we believe in peace and liberty and good stuff like that. There's probably some of that. I'm sure that's what Nancy Pelosi would talk about. I think there's also a much more cynical incentive, which is if China is going to be this rising power and is going to threaten us, you want to throw as many obstacles in its way as you can. And just as Ukraine has dramatically weakened Russia, a war on Taiwan would dramatically weaken China, even if it won. So there's both. This is when when things are easy for United States policymakers, is when our ideals and our interests line up.
Yeah, well, I'm reading, though, in this case, Pelosi defied both the Biden administration's opposition and China's militaristic bluster and went ahead with her visit. So this is not even in line with the administration. And I agree with you. Look, I think it's important to actually, represent some sort of strength towards Taiwan. I'm just curious, what are like in this specific instance with the visit?
What is gained by this visit? And the answer is Nancy Pelosi has made her calculations regarding her constituents. Right? The famous politician Tip O'Neill. You ever hear of Tip O'Neill? Tip O'Neill was Nancy. He was from Massachusetts.
This is the Boston,
he was Pelosi's predecessor. He was a long-time Speaker of the House. He very famously said all politics is local. Right? There you go.
Got the big dig built for Boston on taxpayer dime, national taxpayer dime.
So that's, I think, the explanation is